Welcome back. We're picking up on the wild claim that a lot of chronic problems start with basic deficiencies, and then we're getting into the morning stack everyone seems to have a religion about. Then we land on the weirdest part: community, purpose, and why longevity is not just vitamins and sunlight. The first thing that hit me was how aggressively he blames misread deficiencies for entire diagnoses. That part is not even crazy to me because people do get labeled too fast. But the leap from deficiency to almost everything is where I start squinting. Like, hold on, not every bad mood is a mineral emergency. Still, the anemia example was strong, because repeated folic acid and B12 failing should force a second look. The methylfolate angle is interesting because it turns treat the symptom into treat the pathway, which is great until the internet turns one pathway into a personality. Yeah, people start saying they're low methylation like it's a zodiac sign. But I do think there's a real frustration underneath that, because people want an explanation that feels actionable. And that's why the testing pitch lands, right? Glycemic markers, hormones, genetics, all of it. My only issue is that some people here test everything and immediately build a supplement empire in their bathroom. Then they're 6 powders deep and still tired. The stronger argument is probably precision, not chaos. And then he pivots to the boring stuff, which is always the annoying truth. Salt, water, sleep, sunlight, breath work. No one wants that answer. Everybody wants a molecule with a cool logo instead. The water thing is where he gets very specific and very confident. Mineralized water, trace minerals, different salts. He really treats that as foundational. I get the idea of not just drinking random industrial water forever, but the certainty is doing a lot of work. Baja salt got talked about like it was a national treasure. The marketing budget for that salt must be insane in his brain. The deeper point is probably that people are missing the basics of mineral intake. And then grounding is where the conversation goes from practical to, wait, what exactly are we claiming? The blood-clumping visualization is memorable, I'll give it that. Nothing says wellness like a finger prick and a science demo in your living room. He has the energy of a man who has absolutely ruined dinner parties with this slide. What I do like is the discipline angle. He's using these routines to build trust in himself. That was actually one of the best parts of the whole thing. The promise to yourself idea is more powerful than the physics debate. Because people do break tiny promises all day and then wonder why their confidence is trash. And to be fair, that has nothing to do with PMF mats and everything to do with behavior. The mat might help, but the real magic is probably not lying to yourself at 7 a.m. The red light part was more intuitive, at least in the sense that light obviously affects us. Circadian rhythm, cortisol, melatonin, all of that feels grounded in basic biology. But then it becomes, this fixes everything. And that's where the hype machine wakes up. Still, the idea of buying a giant red panel as a couple's Christmas gift is hilarious. Nothing says romance like mitochondria. The hydrogen water section felt like the most science casino part of the whole episode. He's just casually carrying a portable hydrogen bottle like it's a tiny luxury handbag. But again, he keeps pointing to inflammation as the big umbrella. And then the Ozempic discussion got surprisingly balanced. He wasn't anti-drug in a cartoon way, which I respected. He was basically saying, use it if you need it, but don't cosplay a metabolic emergency. Also, if you're losing a third of the weight from lean mass, that is not a cute trade. The point about pairing it with resistance training is the most defensible part. That and the face changes people keep whispering about. Ozempic face is such a brutal phrase, it sounds like a warning label. Then the conversation gets way more interesting when he talks about meaning and community. That loneliness point is scary because it's not just emotional, it's apparently survival level. The idea that isolation can cut life expectancy in half is a punch in the face. And the broken heart syndrome piece makes it feel painfully human. He kept circling back to cells as communities, which is a nice little mirror for people. The body doesn't seem to like being atomized, and neither do we. That's why the just optimize alone in your room culture feels incomplete. You can't longevity bro your way out of needing humans. Purpose was the other big thread, especially with blue zones and older people staying mobile. The common denominator wasn't one perfect diet, it was usefulness. That hit hard when he talked about grandparents living with family instead of disappearing into institutions. There's something devastating about being required by nobody. And there's something deeply stabilizing about having a job in the ecosystem of a family. I also thought the retirement question was quietly huge. Because a lot of retirement planning talks like freedom is automatically good for the body. But if freedom becomes aimlessness, that can age people fast. So the answer is not stop working, it's don't become spiritually unemployed. That should be on a mug somewhere, honestly. What I appreciated most was that he doesn't separate health from identity. It's not just calories and supplements. It's whether your life has rhythm, trust, and people. And maybe that's the least sexy part of longevity, which is exactly why it matters. All right, final stretch, because this whole series kept pointing to the same thing. You can chase biomarkers, but if your life is chaotic and lonely, the dashboard is only half the story. You can also dismiss the body's signals and end up treating the leaf forever. The sweet spot is probably somewhere between buy all the supplements and ignore everything. And that's a pretty good ending for the series, honestly. We started with physiology and ended with purpose, which feels about right. If there's one takeaway, it's that health is a lot more social than we pretend, and maybe a little less mysterious than the wellness internet wants it to be. That's it for this one, and for the series, so thanks for riding with us. Go make one small promise to yourself, then keep it tomorrow. Welcome back. We're ending on the stuff that actually changes your day-to-day health. Root causes, routines, and why feeling better can somehow get expensive. Which is such a ridiculous sentence, but also completely true. The wildest part is how often simple deficiency gets mistaken for a whole disease. That part made me sit up, because the leaf keeps getting treated while the roots rot. Modern medicine loves a leaf. It really does, and then acts shocked when the tree keeps acting up. The methylation angle is interesting because it reframes a lot of symptoms as missing inputs. Not you are broken, just you might be missing the raw materials. That is way less dramatic and probably way more useful. Like anemia that won't budge until the body gets methylfolate, not plain folic acid. Yeah, and that is a huge difference if you're the person actually living in the body. Because otherwise you can just keep escalating the wrong thing forever. I kept thinking about the way he talked about statins and corticosteroids too. The trade-off is never just one lab number going down. Right, you buy one cleaner headline and inherit a different problem downstream. Health is basically a series of hidden invoices. That is the least sexy way to describe it and somehow the most accurate. What I liked is that he kept pulling it back to measurable basics. Glucose, hormones, deficiencies, inflammation, sleep, movement. Stuff people keep trying to outrun with novelty. Yeah, people want a hack and he keeps handing them a mineral. Which is annoying if you were hoping for a more glamorous answer. The salt thing is funny because everybody hears salt and thinks kitchen table chaos. And then he's out here talking about trace minerals like it's a rescue mission. The larger point is that people are walking around depleted and calling it personality. That line should probably offend half the internet. But the morning stack he described is basically sunlight, water, breath, grounding, repeat. And honestly, that's the part I trust most. Not because every mechanism is settled, but because it's hard to argue with boring consistency. Boring consistency is the least viral health advice on earth. That's why it works, unfortunately. The grounding section was the biggest fork in the road for me. It sounds half mystical, half engineering textbook, which is a dangerous combo. That is exactly where wellness people start getting too confident. But the larger idea of restoring contact with natural light, air, and movement is hard to dismiss. Even if you're not married to every claim, the direction is sane. And then red light is the same story, just with better hardware. Better hardware is such a tech bro way to talk about healing. But I get it, because the mechanism sounded compelling. Light, mitochondria, oxygen, energy. He made it feel like the body is less a machine and more a battery system. And if you buy that, then the whole sleep, skin, energy, inflammation conversation gets tighter. I also liked that he kept saying sunlight first, not fancy devices first. Because otherwise, the whole thing turns into a shopping list instead of a lifestyle. The wellness industry's favorite sport is turning sunshine into a subscription. That is evil and funny at the same time. The hydrogen water part was classic too, because now we're in the era of water with a resume. Normal water walks in, hydrogen water walks in with a portfolio. Still, if somebody is replacing worse habits with better hydration and lower inflammation, that's not nothing. The more contentious part for me was Ozempic, because he was surprisingly nuanced there. He wasn't pretending it's evil, just saying the use case matters, which is rare because the internet prefers either miracles or villainy. And the vanity use case is where things get messy because the side effects are not cosmetic. If you lose lean mass, blunt appetite, and don't train, you're not just shrinking. You might actually be changing the quality of what's left, which is the part people don't want to hear when the before and after photo looks good. Photos are undefeated and also very stupid. Brutal but fair. The family section hit harder than I expected, honestly. He sounded most human when talking about his kids. That part about purpose being the biggest blessing felt real, not polished. And it tied straight into the loneliness point, which is probably the most underrated health issue in the whole conversation. Isolation doesn't just feel bad, it seems to shorten lives. That's a crazy sentence, because it means community is not just emotional support. It's physiology. Imagine telling someone their social life is a biomarker. People would hate that diagnosis. But the Blue Zone's point connected all of it nicely. Mobility, purpose, family proximity, daily usefulness. Not some magical food cult where everyone just happens to be immortal. Right, the real pattern is less sexy than the marketing. I kept wondering what the biggest honest takeaway is for a listener who wants to start tomorrow. Probably not to buy 20 things, but to stop being wildly inconsistent with the basics. Sleep, movement, light, hydration, some testing, and a little humility. Humility is the least supplementable nutrient. Sadly, yes. And I think that's why this conversation worked across both episodes. It kept coming back to the same idea: the body is not a mystery box. It gives signals, and if you keep missing them, it gets louder. Which is a very good place to end this whole series. If someone only keeps one thing, let it be one small promise kept every morning. And maybe a walk outside before the internet gets to you. That's the final episode and the final lap, so thanks for being here with us. We'll see you in the next one, and until then, keep it simple enough to repeat. Welcome back. This one goes straight into the root cause obsession and the daily habits that actually move the needle. What keeps jumping out is how often chronic disease starts looking like a missing input. Like the body is not broken, it is just running on bad inventory. And that is the scary part because people get labeled before anyone checks the basics. Yeah, and then the treatment becomes its own problem. That statin point was wild to me because the trade-off is never sold honestly. You lower one marker and sometimes you quietly wreck hormones, membranes, and recovery. Medicine does love a neat spreadsheet right up until the spreadsheet grows legs. But I also get why people get seduced by it, because a pill feels cleaner than changing your whole life. That is exactly why the routine stuff matters, because it is boring enough to actually work. Start with water, minerals, sunlight, breath, and movement, and suddenly the whole sales pitch gets weaker. Not as sexy as a miracle protocol, unfortunately. The salt part was where I saw people either lean in or completely zone out. Because everybody thinks salt is just salt until someone starts talking about trace minerals like it is a superhero origin story. Still, the larger point is fair. Most people are undernourished in very boring ways. And then they wonder why their brain feels foggy and their sleep is terrible. The grounding thing is where this gets controversial again, because it sounds mystical until you hear the mechanism. And then suddenly we are talking about polarity, blood cells, and whether the Earth is basically a charger. I still think people should be careful about overstating the certainty there. But the broader behavioral claim is hard to argue with. Go outside more. That is a much less controversial sentence than all the science around it. Breathwork felt like the most immediately usable thing in the whole conversation. Because unlike a supplement stack, you can do it this morning and feel the difference. Also, the confidence angle was interesting because it is not just lungs, it is identity. If you keep breaking tiny promises, you stop trusting yourself in subtle ways. That part lands harder than the physiology for me. The red light section was the most futuristic-sounding part, but it was also the least weird to apply. Because everyone wants the sci-fi bed if the side effect is apparently better skin and sleep. Which is how wellness sells, honestly. But the core idea is simple enough. Light is a signal, and the body responds to signal. That is why the morning light piece made so much sense. You are basically telling your clock what time it is. And if your clock is confused, everything downstream gets messy. The hydrogen water part was another one where the reaction is either interesting or this guy has lost it. Right, because a bottle that charges water sounds like a prop from a startup pitch deck. But if the studies are there, it becomes less about the gadget and more about the inflammation argument. My only pushback is that people can get lost in devices and forget the basics again. And that is probably the real theme here. Use tools, but do not outsource your life to them. Ozempic was the perfect example of that tension. The drug can be life-changing for the right person, but it is not a personality correction tool. Exactly. And once vanity enters the chat, people start paying for consequences they did not read about. Which is usually the business model in wellness and in fashion, honestly. The lean mass loss piece matters a lot, because losing weight is not automatically getting healthier. That is where the strength training correction felt important, not optional. You cannot just melt the body and call it optimization. That line should be on a warning label somewhere. What I loved most, weirdly, was how personal it got near the end. Because once he talks about his kids, the whole thing stops sounding like branding. It becomes obvious that the work is tied to family, purpose, and a sense of responsibility. Also, the fact that his kids are literally in the business is kind of the ultimate long-form endorsement. The loneliness and isolation piece hit me hardest, though, because that is not wellness fluff. If social isolation really cuts life expectancy that dramatically, that is a massive public health story. And it fits with everything else he kept saying about community at the cellular level. Cells in community, people in community, same logic in different scales. I do think some of the language gets dramatic, but the emotional truth is not hard to see. People literally age differently when they feel seen and needed. Retirement was another one where the science and the meaning kind of overlap. If purpose drops away, the body often follows faster than we want to admit. So the answer is not golf and a passive income stream, sadly. Or maybe it is, if you are actually emotionally alive on the golf course. The deeper point is that longevity is not just about avoiding death. It is about staying engaged. And that is why the series as a whole worked, because it kept returning to signal, routine, and belonging. Not the sexy version of health, but probably the real one. Which is a pretty good place to end this whole run. If someone listening takes one thing from these 2 episodes, let it be this. Check the basics before you panic. And keep one promise to yourself before the day gets noisy. Preferably one that does not require a $5,000 bed. Thanks for staying with us through the whole series. We will see you in the next one, and until then, keep it simple enough to repeat. Welcome back. This episode is all about root causes, routines, and the weird cost of trying to feel better. Because once you hear the logic, you start wondering how much of modern health is just missed basics, and how much of it is people buying the expensive version of a walk outside. The first thing that hit me was the idea that deficiencies can look like disease. That is the part people skip right past because it's too unglamorous. Nobody wants to hear that their fatigue might be B12, D3, iron, or hormones. They want a dramatic explanation, ideally with a villain. Preferably one they can post about. But his whole argument is that the body sends basic signals before it screams. And if you ignore the root, you end up treating leaves forever. The leaf doctor's line was rude and accurate at the same time. That is the most irritating kind of correct. What I found interesting is how often he framed chronic illness as cumulative load. Fluoride, chlorine, plastics, poor nutrition, bad sleep, no sunlight, all of it stacking. Which sounds dramatic until you realize most people do live like that. Exactly. And then we act shocked when the body starts filing complaints. The mineralized water thing is a perfect example of that mindset. His solution is basically, drink better water and stop pretending table salt is a personality. That line should be on a t-shirt in a health store. But underneath the sales pitch, the point is that trace minerals matter. People obsess over macros and completely ignore minerals like boron and selenium. And those are the boring inputs that make the machine work. The grounding conversation is where it gets really polarizing. No pun intended, but absolutely pun intended. The idea that bare feet on dirt can change blood behavior is wild. It sounds like the kind of thing that either turns out to be profound or completely overcooked. And the tension is that there is always a real need for better evidence and better language. Because if the science is muddy, people start hearing magic instead of mechanism. Still, The broader point about sunlight, outdoor time, and not living indoors is hard to argue with. We are clearly built for a different environment than the one we now call normal. We act like the body should simply tolerate the office cave forever. Then we act surprised when everyone is tired, stiff, and miserable. The breathwork part felt almost more practical than the gadgets, because that was less about buying something and more about keeping a promise to yourself. That actually landed for me. He turned breathwork into a discipline of self-trust, not just a wellness ritual. And that's a much bigger idea than oxygen. It's also a lot cheaper than therapy, though I wouldn't recommend replacing that. Fair point, dangerous sentence, move on. Red light was another one where the conversation split into two versions at once. One version is the tech, the studies, the mitochondria, the circulation. The other version is people trying to build a luxury habit around health. It is very funny that the cure for modern misery sometimes looks like a glowing space heater. Science has terrible branding. But the photobiomodulation angle is genuinely fascinating if you stay grounded in what it claims. Improved circulation, inflammation, recovery, maybe sleep support. And then he linked that to sunlight and circadian timing, which made more sense. Morning light, evening darkness, the whole rhythm of the day. It is almost humiliatingly simple, which is why people hate it until it works. The hydrogen water segment felt like peak biohacker energy. Tiny machine, science words, massive confidence. But again, his argument was about inflammation and measurable effects, not just vibes. The larger pattern is clear. He likes tools that shift the terrain, not just the symptom. Which is why the Ozempic conversation matters so much. Because now we're in a world where the tool is so effective that people forget the trade-off. And the trade-off is not tiny when it can involve lean mass loss and gut slowdown. Exactly, and that is where nuance actually matters. It is not a moral failure to use it for severe obesity or diabetes. But using it as a vanity shortcut while skipping strength training is just borrowing from the future. You can lose weight and still look like you need a nap. That's brutal but fair. I also thought the family part of the conversation gave the whole thing a human center. The health guy was not talking about hacks there. He was talking about belonging. His kids, his wife, the business, the travel, the daily proximity. That matters because he kept saying community changes, longevity, outcomes. And not in a fluffy way, but in actual mortality data. Isolation is not just sad, it is biologically expensive. The broken heart idea, the caregiver decline, the spouse effect, all of that is real. People think loneliness is an emotion and stop there. But if it changes behavior, stress, movement, appetite, and engagement, it becomes physiology. So the cure is not just more supplements, it is fewer Lonely Tuesdays. Which is a very bad slogan and a very good idea. Retirement was another one of those areas where purpose quietly showed up as medicine. The blue zones aren't just about one magical diet. They are about movement, usefulness, and having somewhere to be needed. That is such an underrated human need. Not to be entertained, but to matter. I think that's why the family business setup actually made emotional sense. He is not just building a career, he is building a small ecosystem. Of course, the irony is that success shrinks your circle even as it expands your reach. That is such a weird celebrity businessman tax. You get more access and less ordinary contact at the same time. And then the work becomes trying to stay useful without becoming unreachable. The ethics question around the old mortality database was one of the sharpest parts. Because he was basically saying, I could see the risk, but I could not intervene. And that is frustrating in a very specific way. Imagine seeing the cliff and being legally required to applaud. That is insane, but also somehow exactly how systems behave. His point about insurance and annuities was also a little horrifying in a clean, mathematical way. One side profits when you live longer, the other when you do not. That is capitalism with a spreadsheet and a pulse. But the real ending of the conversation was not cynicism. It was the Gandhi question, and the answer about helping people live better. That brought it all back to intention. Not chasing perfection, just trying to make the basics available and repeatable. Which is probably the cleanest ending for this whole series. No mystical finale, just water, sunlight, breath, and not lying to yourself. And honestly, that feels more durable than any trend. If there is a takeaway from both episodes, it is that health is not one big breakthrough. It is 100 small inputs that either help you or quietly wreck you. So keep the routine small enough to survive a bad day. And keep the people close who make your life feel more lived in. That is us done for this series. Thanks for spending both episodes with us, and we will see you in the next one.